Good afternoon. Welcome to the final study in our book of Genesis using the Wesleyan Publishing House material. We have been looking at relationships between people and between individuals and their God, and discovering a lot about the nature and character of God, and also the faults, foibles, and even noble character of certain individuals. We have been using this chart as our guide, and we actually, because we're in the final lesson here, we're going to read the booklet summary of what we've gone through so far. As we conclude our study of Genesis, let's take a quick look at the people we have met this quarter and what they have taught us about God. Genesis begins appropriately enough with creation in the beginning. When God completed his work of creation, he looked at what he had made and declared it was good. Thus began his relationship with the human race. God set a challenge before the people he created. He created them free to choose to be the kind of people who would maintain fellowship with him. But Adam and Eve chose to disobey God, thus breaking their fellowship with him and with each other. Yet even as God confronted them about their sin, he also announced a plan for eventual redemption. The sin of Adam and Eve began a pattern of human disobedience. The world became so corrupt that God destroyed his creation, saving only Noah and his family and the animals with them in the ark. We learn a number of lessons from Abraham, with whom God developed a special relationship, calling him to leave his home and follow him. God led Abraham to Canaan, promising him that the entire world would be blessed through his descendants. See Genesis 22:18. A promise that was fulfilled centuries later with the birth of Jesus. Abraham developed a trust in God that allowed him to ask boldly that his nephew be spared when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Abraham's confidence in God and his promises was so strong that he could respond faithfully when asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. At first, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, aka the deceiver, seemed to be an unlikely candidate for a special relationship with God. Yet God used Jacob as a step in fulfilling the promises he had made, promises for the promised land and the promised one. God gave Jacob the name Israel, the name by which the chosen people would be known. Jacob's son, Joseph, also had a rocky beginning. Our first view of him showed us a privileged, perhaps naive young man, but Joseph chose to serve God, and God gave him success. So God is the creator, and because of that, he gets to determine who he's going to bless, and more specifically, whose life he is going to step into and make arrangements to bless them, to prosper them, to make them a success. And when we look particularly at the family of Abraham, we recognize it's not just individuals getting a blessing, but it's God blessing the entire earth through this family who knows the one true living God. So that takes us up now to Joseph's life. And one of the core teachings, and in fact this lesson focuses entirely on Genesis chapter 50, where we get to the end point of the book where Joseph is faced with the reality of having to forgive his brothers. And we make the declarative statement, God expects us to forgive those who have harmed us. I'm going to add a caveat to that, or a corollary teaching, and say, yes, that's true, but there is a process for that forgiveness to flow through to have its best results. And I'll explain as we go into some details of the stories today. And there are stories because we're not just going to focus on the end event. We also want to make the point here of waiting is the hardest part, as we talk about bitterness in a little bit. Joseph has to wait 13 years. Abraham waited 25 years for the promise to come. Moses 40, Jesus 30. if God is making you wait, you are in good company. Now, Joseph, if we're looking at it from a family point of view, Joseph actually had to wait 13 years plus another 9, 22 years before he actually got to interact with his father and had that relationship restored. So a lot happens in those years, but he is still processing how does he get back to status normal, happy family. But it is a problem. And we're going to deal with a little bit here with bitterness. I've had some of that in my heart, as I confessed in other videos. And it is quite a process. When you know somebody intentionally harmed you, it is hard not to have a heart of bitterness. And we get to the end in this material, and they're like, oh yeah, Joseph forgave them. Well, let's look at the process here through Genesis chapter 42. Joseph, because he's the governor of Egypt at this time, second only to Pharaoh, he knows that this family has spread beyond Egypt into the surrounding land. So I think he's anticipating the arrival of Israel's sons to come asking for food. So I think there's some process here where he had time to plan ahead. And while he's in this prison cell, there's some desire for vindication and maybe some retaliation. I don't put that past Joseph that had that in his heart, at least in the beginning. So when they show up, I think he's already got this pre-planned, and he's speaking roughly to them, because he is instantly recognizing this is the fulfillment of the dream, that these men have come to him, bowed down to him, and you see that there in verse 6, and he knows it, but they don't know it. There has been such a transformation in Joseph, converting him to being an Egyptian, his language, his dress, his mannerisms, that they don't recognize this is their brother. But he knows. And he accuses them of being spies. Now we're going to delve into a little bit of why is that happening. Because he's clearly making his brothers nervous, and this mentions that they are afraid. In fact, Joseph, in his first encounter with his brothers, although he gives them the food, he puts Simon or Simeon into prison and says, well, you got to prove to me you're not spies before I'll give your brother back. And the arrangement is, you said you had a younger brother, Benjamin. If you're truly just a family and not a group of spies, then you'll produce Benjamin at our next encounter. Now, those of you who have read deeply into the story know that that's going to complicate things for Israel on the other end. The brothers huddle together and they have a conversation. And they don't realize who Joseph is and that he understands everything that they're saying. And Reuben here is saying, didn't I tell you? Don't do this to the boy, and you wouldn't listen. And now this has come about because of what we did to Joseph years earlier. So he's going to be 37 to 39, Joseph is at this point. And Judah, remember, he played a major role in that initial selling him into slavery. He's got to explain to Israel, we got to go back with Benjamin or we're not going to get any food. And he takes personal responsibility that Benjamin will be brought back safely. So they show up with Benjamin, and Joseph invites them into his house to dine with him at the noon meal. And the men are afraid. This is highly irregular. What is going on here? There's got to be a plot out to get us. The guilt of their sin, knowing this may be the negative consequences, what we call karma today. It comes back, you give evil, it comes back to you. And more specifically, He's going to assault us. He's going to make us his servants. He's going to make us slaves like we made Joseph a slave. Hearing this interaction, this is our first time where we see an indication that Joseph's heart is being warmed with compassion. I think he had such an elaborate plan of what he was going to do to get back at his brothers, and he starts to execute this plan, and he's like, I just can't go through with this. So he sets them all down at the table, puts them in birth order, blesses his younger brother with a portion 5 times larger than the rest, and they're all baffled, bewildered that he knows all this, and they make merry with him, but it doesn't end. Joseph hasn't disclosed who he is. In fact, he sends them home with food, with the money in their sack. This is the second time he's doing this. And he puts his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And this is all set up. He sends out a steward with an armed detachment to overtake the men. They go through the whole process of trying to find this silver cup, and they find it in Benjamin's bag. Why have you repaid evil for good? Here is an accusation so that they could be taken bound back to Joseph. And that, in fact, is exactly what's happening in Genesis 44. Joseph goes through the whole process of really sticking it to them and saying, you guys are guilty, now you've stolen things, and now you're going to face some severe consequences. And Judah has to step up. Remember, he is going to be the future great leader of the people of Israel. And so he's got some leadership role here, and he steps up and says, enslave us, take me. We recognize how powerful you are. What can we do to work this out? And at this, Joseph cannot control himself. And now he makes this great public confession that he is, in fact, their brother. And Joseph weeps aloud. This tells us, and we'll see this 2 other times, that he has this huge emotional investment in this whole process. So I think he goes from a real anger and a desire for vindication to now going completely to having mercy and wanting compassion to reign in this situation. And he announces, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? He has been so involved in managing the affairs in Egypt for 7 years of putting the grain into silos and granaries that, and the first years into the famine of managing the dispersion of the food to people, that he has not even been able to step out and find his father and arrange anything with reuniting his family. So he has to comfort his brothers because they're very distressed to suddenly find out that this incredibly powerful leader is in fact this younger brother who predicted through his dreams, or God predicted through the dreams he interpreted, that God was going to make him powerful. And now Joseph has demonstrated that in his powerful position, he can imprison them, he can enslave them, and he can even kill them for the wrongs that they have done to him. And nobody's going to call it into question. So the famine has been going on for 2 years, so add that to the 7 good years. So he's been in this powerful position for 9 years now, and there's still yet 5 more years of famine. How did Joseph find grace to forgive the brothers who set him into motion in this chain of suffering? Well, there's a lot that the group can react to here in processing that. I believe he recognized it was God giving him grace. He had enough insights into getting the big picture of why all this was happening that he could afford grace and forgiveness, because he knew it was according to a greater purpose, a bigger plan that was for the salvation, physical salvation of many people. Sometimes God allows us to see his purpose in what we have experienced. The booklet also adds the corollary thought, but sometimes we don't see it in our lifetime. Corrie ten Boom was famous for her speaking engagements after coming out of the Nazi concentration camp for using this tapestry of a crown. And she said, "We look at our lives as if it were the back of a tapestry. We see a lot of threads, some of them are colorful. We sense there's a grand design, but we really don't see it." Why did her more spiritual sister Betsy die in the concentration camp and Corrie gets out on a clerical error? That doesn't make any sense. And yet someday God will be good enough to show us the other side of the tapestry, and that it all makes divine sense, even if we don't see it. But sometimes we won't see it in our lifetime, and I think that's the biggest frustration for a lot of people. And so in Genesis 45, Joseph explains, "I saw God in this picture. I saw him sewing the threads. I saw him making the tapestry. And it's to keep you alive and the people in Egypt. It's not you who really had control of the situation, but God was behind the scenes making sure this was the ultimate outcome." What experience have you had that at first puzzled you, but you later understood that God had been at work? I just, this week, published a book, for pastors only, dealing with rejection in ministry, where I tell quite at length, over 400 pages, my process of dealing with situations in life where rejection is the major theme, and it doesn't make sense when you're going through it. But if you step back, and I had an opportunity in the process of writing the book, of stepping back and processing it in my middle years, 50s, and saw God had been at work. And I didn't enjoy all the process, but the greater outcome, and for me, this book, that I hope will be of help to other pastors and particularly millennials in looking at the church and wondering what is going on. This is really a behind the scenes look at what happens in churches and why. So we look at the bad that happens and we try to find the good that we can make out of it to bless other people. And Joseph definitely had that perspective. So now we have 17 years. Israel has come with his entire family into Egypt, the best of the land, Goshen, for them as shepherds and herdsmen. And 17 years, Joseph gets to be with his father Israel. And the brothers are like, "We're glad Dad's alive, because Joseph won't touch us." And we'll read now the actual introduction to this lesson, because this is where it really starts for this booklet. When Jacob died, Joseph's brothers were afraid Joseph would retaliate for the wrong they had done him. But Joseph assured them that he had forgiven them. He explained that what they had intended as harm, God had used to save many lives. Joseph died without returning to the promised land, but he died confident that God would keep his promise and the children of Israel would return to claim their inheritance. So we basically are looking at these brothers who are for 17 years unsure whether Joseph had really forgiven them. So great was their guilt over what they had done they're not sure they would have forgiven if they were in similar circumstances. And when Joseph hears this heart that they don't really believe that he forgave them, he wept. Why did Joseph weep when his brothers came to him asking for forgiveness in their father's name? I think he came to a place where he didn't intend anymore for them to be in this constant state of unease. He really wanted true reconciliation. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? I know God. I know he would not be pleased with me harming you. So it's done. It's over. Don't be afraid. He reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And this, of course, is the ideal Christian state, where we're so close to God that even though wrongs happen to us, even though there is great suffering, we still trust God will make it all right. And he will compensate in his way for the wrongs done to us. And that's not always in material blessings, of course. The peace of mind, the ability to love, the grace to forgive are huge intangibles that we can't put a price tag on. And when we get those and we learn contentment with what we have, instead of the constant yearning, dissatisfaction that comes with wanting more and more, those are beyond measure as opposed to obtaining material goods. You meant evil against me in this version, but God meant it for good. Let's just call it for what it was. You guys were not in a good state of mind when you took those actions. Let's just acknowledge that. But you're not the same people anymore. And the booklet ends challenging us to find verses in the Bible where God assures us that he has our good in mind. We base this on our understanding of God's character, a loving, gentle, caring God who generally wants the good for his people. And so take a moment, reflect on some verses. I'm so happy we had this time together to really go into some complicated concepts and some solid truths. I hope this has blessed you. If you want to continue to understand my heart and mind, please buy my personal memoir, For Pastors Only, Dealing with Rejection in Ministry. God bless.